in this next discussion with Aimee Boulanger with the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, co-facilitated by my colleague, Ashley Smith-Roberts. So we'll go into that discussion now and follow with some live Q&A with Aimee and Ashley. Welcome back, everyone, to the University of Arizona Mining Law Summit. At this portion of the summit, I'm delighted to introduce you to Aimee Boulanger. My name is Kristi Bruckner. I'm the Executive Director of Sustainable Development Strategies Group, and co-facilitating with me today is Ashley Smith-Roberts, Senior Director of SDSG. And today we're talking with Aimee Boulanger, who is the Executive Director of the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. Aimee has worked on mining issues for more than 20 years with substantial experience supporting communities who are directly affected by mining, as well as working with mining communities to optimize sustainable development benefits of the mining sector. She has served as IRMA's leadership since 2012, bringing to the initiative her experience working across stakeholder groups to help advance common goals.
Thanks for having me, Kristi. Really appreciate the chance to talk with you and to Ashley here today.
Yes, thanks for joining us.
Great. So Aimee, thank you so much for being with us today. And just to get this interview started, can you give us a brief overview of IRMA's objectives and how the initiative works to advance those objectives, including through the IRMA standard for responsible mining assurance?
Yes, thank you, Ashley, and thanks, Kristi. So I'm going to share my screen to answer this first set of questions so I can just show you a bit more about IRMA and how it works. And then I'll pop this off as we converse more. But so IRMA is the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, and it's fundamentally two things working together. So it is a standard for responsible mining, which is a shared definition across stakeholder groups of what does best practice look like in mining, and that's best practice across a diverse set of 26 different topics. It's comprehensive then. It's meant, instead of trading some issues off of one another, to bring under one house a range of what is described as responsible practices in mining, and then also an independent third-party way to evaluate a mine's performance against that standard. So where auditors can come in and look at how a company performs using both a desk review of materials submitted by the mine, but then also a visit to the site with input from stakeholders and rights holders, mine workers, community residents, Indigenous peoples, if they're there. And when I keep talking about this idea of a shared definition or of multi-stakeholderism, what we're talking about are the 5 stakeholder sectors that govern IRMA. This includes mining companies, companies who purchase mined materials like jewelers, electronics makers, car companies, the NGOs, not-for-profit organizations, both social and environmental justice, organized labor representing mine workers, and then mining affected communities. And so each of these 5 houses of IRMA have 2 seats on the board. And they agree to work together as they set the standard of IRMA or the rules for auditing and how the system works. They agree to work together by consensus wherever they can. They can vote, but anytime there's 2 no votes from a single house, that serves as a block. It's because IRMA really is about not leaving a house behind and about creating value for all stakeholder sectors and forwarding more responsible mining practices globally. And so, Ashley, you asked about the standard, and this is the list of chapters that are there. It's the 26 chapters that include environmental and social responsibility, also issues of business integrity, and the planning for positive legacies, what happens with reclamation and closure and when a mine is no longer there, and how is a community dealing with their economic opportunities and moving on from a mine's legacy. So as you can see, it's a broad range of issues. Again, as I said at the beginning, it's really meant to create a more comprehensive sense of what is responsible mining. So we're not talking about worker health and safety or clean water. We're not talking about Indigenous people's rights or biodiversity, but bringing those different metrics under one house. And it will certainly be true with many mines. They'll have some areas where their performance is stronger than others, and we encourage mines to contextualize why they have those strengths or challenge areas, but it has a more transparent conversation around how mines are performing. So again, it applies to all mined materials except for the energy fuel sector. So we're not doing oil and gas or thermal coal or uranium, but otherwise it can be used equally for copper or tin or gold or diamonds, cobalt or lithium, a range of materials, iron ore, that are of concern and interest to people today, anywhere on the planet, with assessment that's both reviewing a mine's documents, but the assessment of the mine is at the mine site level, which is important to mining affected communities who are aware that they carry the greatest level of the impact. So we're assessing not just at the company level, but at the mine site level. And certification is at a best practice level, but mines at any level of performance are welcomed in. And Ashley, I don't know if I should pause there or if you would like me just to talk about what the achievement level in IRMA is.
Yeah, I think that if you want to go ahead and talk about the achievement levels, that would be a great next step.
Okay, so I'll just fill this in and hand back to you. But so certification in IRMA is the top level. That would be that IRMA 100s that's there, where mines are able to meet all of the requirements relevant at their site. And when I say relevant, you know, we have a chapter on cyanide, and some mines aren't using cyanide in their processing. Of course, then that's not relevant. But otherwise, we consider most of the chapters to be relevant for all, whether that's protecting water resources or how a community is engaged by their company. So the levels below IRMA 100 are this IRMA 50 and 75 and IRMA transparency. The transparency is simply for any mine, no matter where it is in its journey toward greater environmental and social responsibility, can be audited against the IRMA standard and just simply share their score. And this can be a way for a mine who, even though they may not be at the 50 or the 75 level, they can show places where they have their strengths, where they have their challenges, and increase a more authentic and verified performance conversation with their investors, purchasers, the community around them, and others. At the 50 and the 75 level, that's a performance level achievements. So this is where mines are meeting 50% in each of the 4 main areas of the standard that I covered, or higher, or the 75 and higher. And on those, the mine needs to include in that 50 or 75% 40 critical requirements that in order to get those achievement levels. So it's both the percentage and to make sure you haven't missed those ones that include issues like human rights and no child labor and the protection of water resources, the engagement of the community. But those are the other achievement levels that are there. So we really welcome mines at any level in their journey to come in, show how they're performing now, contextualize the challenges they have as well as the things they're proud of. It's an opportunity for mines at any level to get recognition for what they feel like they already do well, and then also speak to their intentions to improve over time. So why don't I stop there and hand back to you then, Ashley.
Great, thank you so much for that.
So Aimee, this seminar is focused on community impacts and sustainable development. What key actions does IRMA require companies to take to advance community engagement and community participation throughout a mining project?
Well, great question. You know, on the community level, I'm going to hit a couple of these things that are on this slide, and then things aren't here too, but actually I'll go back a couple slides and just show you in the IRMA standard, you can see that first of all, a mine itself is being asked to engage with its community. So that's why when you see this, some of these chapters, you've got community health and safety, or you've got stakeholder engagement under business integrity, or Indigenous people's rights. So the idea of is that a mine itself should have its own engagement with a community over time. And then that's part of what auditors are assessing, is the mine's engagement. But then once a mine comes into IRMA review, IRMA does a public noticing of an audit before it happens, and then a community and workers are encouraged to speak directly with auditors. They're given safe space to do so, so that they can give their own sense of the community's perspective on the mine. And then the mine audit, after it's gone through, also becomes a transparent document that the community can review, as well as mines, purchasers, investors, and others. So, and to go forward a little bit, I mean, one thing that's also important is, when I talked about earlier the houses that govern IRMA, is that IRMA's governance also means that we are fundamentally in our own system accountable to communities who've been directly impacted by mining. And so it's to create value and accountability and credibility for communities, as well as for a mine who wants to increase their market value by distinguishing themselves out in the market.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Aimee. And speaking of communities, what special considerations does the IRMA standard require for Indigenous communities? IRMA currently has one of the most comprehensive standards when it comes to Indigenous populations. And can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so IRMA has a chapter that's on two chapters, one that's on cultural heritage and speaks to the protection of cultural heritage, and then a separate chapter that's on Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent. It does use the word consent, and it says that for a mine to reach an IRMA achievement level, they should have the consent of the Indigenous community in which they're operating. That free, prior, and informed consent is also considered one of IRMA's 40 critical requirements. So even if you want the 50 or the 75 level in IRMA, you should demonstrate that you do have that consent. Now, for mines operating in places where they do not have the consent of an Indigenous community where they're based, they can, of course, still engage in IRMA and step into the IRMA transparency level. They can show perhaps they exceed by percentage 50 or 75 and an average, but we still, for us to transfer an achievement level at that level, we ask that they meet an Indigenous people's consent in their community, that fundamentally they should be working in a community which consents for them to be there and has supported their operations. I guess one more thing I'll say about that too is we recognize that's a dynamic process. I mean, first of all, we know that there may be mines that have operated for years, sometimes decades, and they did not come in with the prior consent of their community. But some of those mines may have since then worked with greater awareness and sensitivity to build that relationship and may now have consent. So we say for existing mines who didn't have that, if you can demonstrate that you have now achieved that consent and that you've worked to create a relationship with that community where they do feel they've been consented with and they are in support, the mine can do that. And it also says that that's a dynamic experience for the years forward to come, that consent is not a one-time agreement, and that as a mine changes, as impacts may grow, or as the site may expand and things change, that consent is something that needs to be an active process that's renegotiated with an Indigenous community.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
IRMA is working to advance contributions of the mining sector to sustainable development, including the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. What do you see as key areas where mining can make a much greater positive impact in advancing the SDGs than what we currently see in the world today?
Well, that's a great question, and I'd love to turn that question back to you as well, Kristi, because I know that you and Ashley are experts in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But so I'll take your question in good faith and answer it, but then I'd love to hear what you both have to say about that as well. But certainly, you know, a lot of the focus tends to be, and the talk has been around alleviating poverty and benefit sharing with communities. But what we're really looking at as well, and especially looking into a climate stressed world in the future, is the kinds of things where environmental issues and social issues overlap and are clearly integrated. So the protection of water resources and water and waste produced by mines, whether it's the dewatering, the removal of water, or contamination of water resources, can be some of the greatest impacts. And while they're viewed as environmental issues, they're frequently also human rights issues. A community's drinking water or fresh water that's not used as drinking water today, but may in the years ahead become what's relied on for drinking water sources, or may be sources for fisheries and critical food sources. I mean, these are places where mining being done differently moving forward than it's been done in the past are key ways that we can meet UN SDGs as well with these. I mean, one thing that's really beautiful about the SDGs is their aspirational high level of expectation to reach toward. They're not dumbing down, they're really asking for things like no hunger, and the idea of how cross-sectional they are. The IRMA standard to that end too, at the end of each of those 26 chapters, cross-references to others. So for example, community engagement is cross-referenced in almost all other chapters. So the water chapter doesn't sit separate from how you engage with your community. And I think that cross-sectoral focus is so key in the SDGs as well. But I'd love to hear what the two of you have to say too about SDGs and what you think about IRMA and that role too.
Absolutely. I think, you know, looking at the cross-sector approach as well that we see in the IRMA standard, gender equality is another approach that is really weaved throughout the IRMA standard in a way that helps the standard be aligned with the Sustainable Development Goal and Goal 5 of gender equality. We see a lot of opportunity for mining companies to do even more through community benefit sharing agreements and undertakings on issues that a particular community and its unique needs may need more special attention to. So, you know, there's no cookie cutter approach across every community in the world, but a company and community might work together to see that there should be more emphasis on sustainable agriculture, for example, and how benefits are shared in the model of a mine. This could also come into play in climate mitigation and adaptation. How can a mine be developed in a way that mitigates greenhouse gas emissions? What types of infrastructure will help not only alleviate risk due to climate impacts, but also help communities be more resilient to those impacts in a way that will sustain a temporary or permanent mine closures? But there's so many opportunities for mining companies to advance the SDGs, and we see that this is really imperative in a time when minerals and mine materials are greatly needed for the green energy transition. Mm-hmm. Ashley, anything you would like to add to that response?
Yes, I'd just like to confirm that energy, I think, is a really important place where mines could have an amazing impact on the UN SDGs. Mines are often very energy intensive operations, so even putting in place and implementing standards that energy efficiency is increased, or a greater amount of energy is able to incorporate renewables, if that makes sense for that specific mine project. Things like that, I think, are really important, and a way that mines can start thinking about how they can contribute to sustainable development. And then I think also to Aimee's earlier point, just the fact that the UN SDGs do bring in so much work around cross-sector alliances and multi-stakeholder partnerships. I think that's a really important element where mines can make sure that they are engaging in these multi-stakeholder processes so that we're all working together to align the world more with sustainable development. So, yeah.
Those are great inputs, and springing off from what you both brought up on that too, that we are required by our own charters that we will evaluate and revise the IRMA standard every few years, because of our definitions of what best practice is in this space will continue to evolve over years. And as the first mines are just now being audited against the IRMA standard, we're learning a lot from them and from the communities that they're in and their workers about our own metrics and how can we improve. And so a couple of the chapters where I know we're already taking a good look at for next year's revision, one is around gender equality. Right now we deal with gender as we deal with a number of other issues where you can have disproportionate impact or vulnerability. That includes, the issues of youth, people with disabilities, cultural minorities. But there's a question of should we draw out gender into its own chapter? Because of the significance of the issues there, by doing so, do we minimize the impacts to the other groups I've just mentioned? Or better highlight them? Right now, as you said, it's integrated throughout the standard, and we're really asking, is that the best way to deal with it? So we'll really look forward to others helping us decide on that. But similarly, our chapter on greenhouse gas emissions, passed in 2018, version of the current standard that's live, represented what could be agreed between the mining industry sector and purchasers and civil society, NGOs and others at that time. But already the world has outpaced that, we believe, and that we'll be visiting that chapter again with a greater sense of expectations and targets for greenhouse gas emissions. And what's expected at mine sites is increasingly even more mining companies are making their commitments to carbon neutrality and greener energy sources and greater efficiency and conservation of energy on site. So I think it's a really exciting and dynamic space as we even redefine best practice. So
that's great, Aimee. I love hearing that the standard continues to evolve as you guys learn more about best practices and as the world just continues to evolve with mining and sustainable development. So thank you for sharing that. So speaking about this issue of sustainable development and the other issue that may be on everyone else's mind at this point in time with COVID-19. Mm-hmm. So some may see these great ideas around advancing sustainable development through the mining sector as possibly being on hold due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you agree? Have you seen or heard any conversations around this?
Well, I mean, the issue of COVID-19 crosses so many different aspects of the work that we're doing in this topic. So, everything from you have places where you have Indigenous communities which have fly-in, fly-out mines and mine working staff who said, look, we don't want outsiders coming in right now. We've had, a history of centuries of imported illness and disease from outsiders coming in. And so we don't want that. And you can understand that fear in a sense of walling themselves off to protect themselves from imported illness. And then you also have labor unions who will say, look, we've got our membership is freaking out because half of them are out of work and the other half are at work, but they're afraid of getting sick at work. And of course, here we've got an illness where it's dynamic, what we know, we're learning in real time. And so are workers protected because the bus that takes people from point A to B has half of its usual capacity? The truth is we don't really know yet. Does that protect you? Does it not protect you? We're learning in real time, and that is incredibly challenging for mining affected communities and the workforce in mines. And certainly there is a sense among some that this is not a time where we're going to talk about environmental and social responsibility because responsible practices are a luxury conversation, and we're in bare survival mode right now. And I think when the COVID shutdowns initially began back in March and April, there was some of that sense. And certainly some sectors have been hit more painfully than others, and certainly some communities have suffered disproportionately. But I think even in those, what we're seeing is that this is not a luxury conversation. There's a sense that the businesses that come out of this and the communities who can sustain themselves out of this hard time will be those who are most resilient. And in the business community, resilience will be built on environmental and social responsibility as part of the DNA of that company. You know, for the companies who already had a rich dialogue with their community, who already had emergency planning in place, who already had active communication with their communities, it was that much easier for them to speak directly to their workers in the community when COVID happened. And you'll see a number of them say that you know, that IRMA's expectations around community health and safety, as well as worker health and safety, and those stakeholder engagement were the right structure for them to have a conversation on a whole set of issues we couldn't have foreseen, like COVID-19. So I think what we've seen is, and rather than, while there may have been initially a retrenchment and a backing off of commitments, is a re-engagement and a greater sense of responsibility, and not just for mining companies or the communities they're in, but also for purchasers, that the people who are making the cars we drive or the phones we use, you know, jewelry, have said, look, this is going to be direct to our expectation. We're making a commitment going forward that everything we do is going to be about responsible sourcing in a broader sense of what that means.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you're right about that, Aimee. Your point about resilience really speaks out as well. And going along with this, what do you see as opportunities that we can leverage in this moment? You've already mentioned some of them, but how do we take advantage of this time as stakeholders to work to rebuild these economies toward a brighter future?
Well, a few thoughts I have on that. I mean, one is to make really clear the ask, you know, is that for the people who make, as I mentioned, those purchasers of mine materials who make cars, buildings, jewelry, electronics, is that they need to make a really clear ask to the mining sector for what they want, and that they want the choice to buy materials which have been mined or sourced using best practices. Some of the mining industry will say, look, IRMA asks a lot. It's comprehensive, it's rigorous. Do we need to do all that? Does the market care? Because we're really going to have to invest in making those improvements and those additional pieces. And we don't know, does the market really care, or is it giving lip service to this? So I think purchasers need to be very clear they do care. For example, BMW right now is putting out to all of their suppliers, whether it's tier one, the people who sell them the bolts and sheet metal, or to mining companies broadly who mine the materials they use, whether that's iron ore or copper, others. We want mines that are audited against IRMA. Others need to make a really clear ask like that, so that the mining industry gets that really clear sense. I think the other thing to your question on that, Ashley, too, is that looking forward is to not trade issues off of one another. You know, I spoke to that at the beginning, is that even when I speak to groups right now about the idea of greenhouse gas emissions and what it means, you know, mining happening in a world that needs to make an essential a green energy transition, is that we not look just at the greenhouse gas emissions chapter in IRMA, that it's at the mine level. Yes, it's worthy to try to reduce our emissions and our energy use there, but we don't want to talk about that at the expense of talking about cultural heritage or clean water, or the management of waste when it's putting communities at a direct human rights risk for their health and safety. And we can be that way. We can get to a place where we get kind of a tunnel vision, and we're talking only about child labor, or now we're talking only about mine waste and tailings, or we're talking only about greenhouse gas emissions. Is that this comprehensive sense, because they are so interrelated, is important. I mean, of course, at some sites, some issues are going to be more important than another. A community may have much greater concerns over blowing dust in that community than over noise, and that's absolutely fine. But we want to be careful not to create the fad issues of the day that really minimize what may be some of the greatest impacts there. And I think that will be part of it, is that we tend to want a short list because a short list is easy for any of us to focus on. But it's a time for recognizing that we're in such an interconnected world. We need a comprehensive look at environmental and social responsibility.
Great points. Thank you, Aimee.
Aimee, as I noted in your introduction, you've been working in the mining sector across stakeholder groups for over 20 years. How have you seen community impacts and benefits associated with mining evolve over that time period?
Well, I wish I could say I saw more evolution. I've seen more consistency than I've seen evolution, and that's too bad. Because there's a lot of broken trust between mining companies and communities and NGOs, and arguably it's some of the greatest chasm between the private sector and an affected community and NGO sector. Now, of course, this was true in others. We had these challenge points between the forestry sector and in agriculture, and change has come to these places. It's come to seafood and the garment sector, and it was later to come to mining. And I think that's in part because a lot of the world doesn't understand mining. It tends to happen far from urban centers. Sometimes it's literally underground and in the dark, right? And many people are increasingly aware of, where does their food come from, their power, but they may not be as fluent in where do their mine materials come from. And I think that's frustrating for all of those stakeholder groups, right? It's frustrating to be a mining company thinking nobody understands what you do. It's frustrating thinking that your critics, aren't recognizing they're using their materials every day. It's frustrating for mining communities to feel like the world doesn't understand that it's not done with a pick and shovel most of the time, and that industrial scale mining may leave, centuries of an impact behind for them, after a 20 or a 30-year mine life. So, but I think that's changing right now. I think maybe even in the last 5 years, what didn't change that much in 20 years, in the last 5 it has. And in part that may be because even as the world has accelerated forward with a lot of innovation and new practices, we've also had some of our most heartbreaking mine disasters. Even in the last 5 years, we lost 270 lives in Brazil from a mine waste tailing spill last year, and before in Brazil only a few years earlier in a similar situation, a similar mine waste collapse in British Columbia that sent waste into a salmon-bearing stream where First Nations people felt that their heritage was deeply impacted. And so I think there is a reckoning moment that we're all feeling. I think the truth is that there are few people who really know how are we going to deal with mine waste going forward, but all mines are on it now. And I think that this moment that says, look, as long as we are all going to use these materials, and as long as there's a press for increasing demand for some of these materials that go into wind turbines, solar panels, electric batteries, that we better figure these issues out so that we don't undermine the importance of a green energy transition at the top of our supply chain. The solar sector and those others who are part of green energy transition understand supply chains, and they understand the fact that you need to do full cost accounting or a life cycle analysis, and that raw materials are part of that. So I think that opportunity is actually right now for a shifting, and certainly local communities are going to demand it because they look at past broken promises and are not going to make it easy to do permitting without a completely new paradigm.
Great. Thank you so much, Aimee. And as we wrap up this session, is there anything else at all about IRMA that you'd like to share? Whether that's talking about the benefits for mining companies to become engaged with IRMA, or key market drivers for responsible business practices, or anything else. What else would you like to share about IRMA in these last few moments?
Well, I think two things I'd like to bring up are is that from a supply chain perspective, is that obviously, we're talking about at the mine level, and almost none of us, certainly the three of us here and most consumers don't buy directly from the mine. Even the people who are making your cars or your jewelry are frequently not buying direct from the mine. So we're building both cooperations and chain of custody agreements so that you can track the value of materials that have been audited against IRMA at the mine level through the supply chain, and make sure that there's value and accountability at each of those places. And we're crafting agreements with other systems like Responsible Steel, for example, which is looking at the steel sector, but they don't do mining. They're going to source from other mining standards and to their, while they then look at the processing. But we also have a smelting and refining substandard for those who aren't in something like responsible steel. So again, you can really take the value of environmental and social responsibility there and walk it, if you will, all the way through the chain to the end. And I guess I'd say the other thing is for any who are, of your participants who are listening, the value of IRMA is directly respondent to and accountable to those who engage. And, you know, all stakeholder sectors should have a voice into IRMA, and we should be accountable to all. That's what makes it work and makes it special. And so we'd love to hear from any on whether or not it's the metrics. Are we asking the wrong question for the way to measure performance? Are there improvements we can make into how we audit it, to the capacity building and support for mines or for communities to know how to use this as a tool? We'd really love to hear from diverse stakeholders about how this tool can be used for those who are already out there doing the work, regardless of what stakeholder sector they're in.
Thank you so much for your time, for the extraordinary work that you and your colleagues at IRMA are doing, your innovative work to move us towards sustainable development. Thank you so much, and we'll close now and look forward to some Q&A from those of you participating in the chat thread. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kristi. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, we're so pleased that we have Aimee Boulanger with us today and Ashley Smith-Roberts as well. And we have a lot of questions and comments already coming in through the chat thread. One, I'll just note, Aimee answered it in the thread from Lauren. Is there a similar voluntary certification system for oil and gas? And Aimee responded, Equitable Origin is a system built originally just for oil and gas and now includes renewable energy sources as well. Other standards are Better Coal, which is focused on coal mines. So additional questions. One is from Kirst, who is a senior in the mining engineering department and vice president of the program's SME student chapter. And he said it's very interesting learning about IRMA and their standards for development. It seems like this organization is doing similar work to the Responsible Mining Index, and that is very important. So I'll just stop there, and there's a second part to the question, and give Aimee a chance to respond about any similarities with the Responsible Mining Index.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that, and great question too. So the Responsible Mining Index has a few places where they're different than what we're doing, and then overlapping and mutually informing. So the index is, they set similarly some codes of what would look like responsible mining, and then indexing companies' performance against it. Though they are focusing on company level, where we're looking at mine sites, and they're not auditing. So they're not going out to themselves check on what they have, but they're working with information that's in the public sphere. So for example, they'll look at a Rio Tinto or a Vale or an Anglo-American or global companies around the world, and they will send them a questionnaire, take information in, also check information in the public domain, and then rank performance based on that at a company level. Now, IRMA is auditing mine sites where the mining happens. That's very important to the civil society groups that are engaged in IRMA, because they say that's where the impacts are, and they don't want to aggregate across a company level. They want to look site by site, and they want that assurance of independent third-party review. That said, there's real value with both, and you're learning things which can deeply cross-reference, right? By looking at a company level, you do say, okay, we're not going to just choose a few sites here. We're going to look at what's practiced across. By looking at the site level, you're checking that place to place. So we're pretty excited about the opportunities to mutually inform, and we do stay in close touch with the Responsible Mining Index and their base out of Europe.
Thank you. The second part of Kirst's excellent question is an issue that is challenging for many companies and governments and communities as well. And the topic is about free, prior, and informed consent of a community. And the question is, this was one of the most interesting concepts that you brought up, and the idea that free, prior, and informed consent of a community must be met before a mining company can begin operations. I think that informing communities more about the operation and bringing them into the mine planning process may have some great results, like reducing safety incidents, making employees want to work at a site where their voice is heard. Can you elaborate more on how consent is given? Do you know of any companies that have policies where this consent is continually reevaluated to ensure that the community is as on board as possible with the project?
So another great question, and we could talk for 90 minutes just on that, and we should, like, let's put that on the calendar ahead. But so a few things I'll say about that is free, prior, and informed consent has the word prior in it. The idea is that communities, Indigenous communities, are asked to provide their consent before mining happens. And that's what the IRMA standard says as well. That means that this early phase of exploration and development, which is so critical on multiple levels in mining, it's critical for a mining company in terms of getting investment to a project to happen, but it's critical for, do you have the community's support? How about the baseline biological studies, baseline water quality studies, right? All these issues that come, mine design. If you do it right from the start, you're minimizing all kinds of social and environmental harm that can happen in the cumulative years ahead in mining. In many cases, there are many current existing mines that did not have consent. In some cases, they do not now have consent. So the IRMA standard both speaks to, you should be driving for that consent. And if you want IRMA recognition, you have to show as a mine that you do have the consent of that community in which you're operating. If you didn't have it when you started at that prior point, you can't turn the clock back, but are you doing things now that demonstrate that you have worked now to have the community in which you're operating support and consent for what you're doing, and that lay out and acknowledge the fact that that's dynamic, right? Consent now, like any relationship, doesn't mean you're going to have consent a year from now, 3 years from now, as the mining operation changes, as the community's feelings about the mining operation or their own politics shift and change. So there is, in addition to IRMA's requirements, there's a robust guidance document that talks to these things and uses case studies of different places where it's happening, but it's one of the most challenging issues. I think we can all agree. There's a few chapters in IRMA that are really hard. In many cases, we don't have good examples of where it's happening well. And so what we're trying to do is just stay at the fore of the conversation and create financial value and recognition for those who do lead that way in making in guiding us all to a consent that's richer. I guess one other thing that I'll say too is that any exploration of a free, prior, and informed consent is going to be quite different to community. I mean, you all know how it's different in Indigenous communities in the US or Canada from one another, but globally, right? What Indigenous consent is going to look like in Peru is going to be quite different than what it might look like in Indonesia or in Northern Canada. And the standard speaks to that as well, as it's culturally appropriate and sensitive process for them.
Kurs, I also encourage you to read this portion in particular of the IRMA standard, if it's intriguing to you, and the section on communities, and you'll see a lot of really practical guidance there, and the guidance document itself as well. So those are great resources.
Yeah, that's a question that I wanted to ask of you all, and thank you, Aimee, for just an excellent presentation. For the people that want to review the IRMA document itself and any commentary, where if they will go to the internet, is that current document available there?
It is. You can read the IRMA standard and the guidance document if you want to add a couple hundred more pages to your research as well. So you can look at that depth. If you were a mining company who's on here as well, you have access to a tool called the self-assessment tool, which is one that is a mine can use publicly. They can share they're using it, or they can use it confidentially. And it's a digital tool that allows a mining company to go requirement by requirement in the IRMA standard. And for every requirement, check how they're performing, fully meeting things, substantially, partially, what's the difference between those, it explains it, and it is directly linked to that broader guidance document. So they can look at it in real time and get a sense of how they perform against it as well. But any viewer can come onto the IRMA website and find both documents easily in the resources section.
I just posted the standard in the chat thread as well, so you should be able to see that. And we'll add it to the file that John noted at the very beginning of the summits, that will have all of these resources available online for attendees.
Yes, we'll pull all those together afterwards, and our communications department needs to put all that into a single file for you. So that'll probably take a day or so, but we'll have it all there.
Great, thank you so much. And Aimee, we're so lucky to have you here for the live Q&A today at the Mining Summit. There is another question here for you from Kelly Fuller. And Kelly is asking a US specific question here. So in the US, will the IRMA auditors check for compliance with environmental laws and regulations in regard to biodiversity beyond the Endangered Species Act? And this question is being asked because right now we are noticing an emerging trend in the US where some mining companies are claiming exemption from certain US environmental regulations that protect biodiversity. So can you speak a bit more to that?
Sure. This is a good example. At one point in the video, we talked about cross-referencing between different chapters, things that are related to one another. So to the question that Kelly asks, there's several different chapters that are going to address what Kelly's coming at. I mean, one is the very first chapter in the IRMA standard is legal compliance. So voluntary initiatives have to take great care to not get ahead of the role of law and government. While we can move more nimbly and we can help create market value for going beyond legal compliance, we also want to underpin the importance of legal compliance and of laws and government. So that's one, is that a mine is going to be asked by auditors who are evaluating them in the IRMA standard, are you legally compliant, and going to be looking through that. There's also a chapter on biodiversity, asking how mine is impacting biodiversity and addressing that and reducing negative impacts to biodiversity. There's also a chapter, if you're talking about aquatic life, on water resources and water resource protection as well. And then on community engagement, separate from the chapters which are also on cultural heritage or Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent. And amidst those issues, legal compliance and community engagement are considered critical requirements, which means if you want to get any achievement level in IRMA, beyond just transparently sharing your score, but the 50, the 75, 100, you need to hit those issues. You can't discount legal compliance or the importance of engaging with a community. So a community group who felt that a company was not respecting law in their region would have an opportunity to have voice, because an IRMA audit itself also is a publicly noticed thing. It's not, their community is not just going to see the report once it's done, but they're going to have given an opportunity to participate in the audit as well. So there are multiple places to raise concerns, whether that's about biodiversity or water quality or other concerns with a site.
Great, thank you so much.
One last question before we go to our lunch break pertains to artisanal and small scale mining. So the question has to do with, how to ensure that the concerns of artisanal miners are really integrated into efforts towards sustainable development. So Aimee, maybe you could touch on what the IRMA standard says about ASM and relationships between large scale mines and artisanal and small scale miners.
Yeah, thanks to Kirst for this one as well. So Kirst is right. In many areas of the world, a fair percentage of mine material is coming from artisanally scaled mines, the individual pick and shovel miner. So there are separate systems to deal with this because, of course, if you're trying to get a large industrial scale mine to find incentive to perform better, that's a completely different strategy for how you create change than when you're talking to people who are often at a subsistence level out there working individually, often informally in that work. So two things in that. One is that IRMA has a chapter on artisanal scale mining, asking the large scale mine to be accountable to reducing conflict and violence at the interface when ASM overlaps with your large scale mine, and then to look at ways to promote formalization of artisanal scale mining and to look at benefit sharing and things like helping to create markets. And then the other is that as a system, though, we also know that our work could easily be used to create greater value for large scale mining over artisanal scale mining. So we have collaborative agreements working with other organizations like the Alliance for Responsible Mining or PACT or Impact and others who are focused in particular at that level so that we make sure our work is mutually informing and addresses those issues of artisanal scale miners.
We are at time, but because there's only one question remaining, we'll ask and answer it and then break for lunch. So this last question from David Stanley is asking for a bit more clarification on free, prior, and informed consents. Does IRMA promote any particular type of mechanism by which FPIC is obtained?
So David, I'm going to answer your question in brief, and I'm going to tell you it's super disrespectful for me to answer it in brief because I know it's a complex, and that's exactly what you're highlighting here. So I, like John, encourage you to look at the IRMA chapter on this and the guidance document. But I completely agree with what you're saying there. It's a dynamic process, and the standard actually does say that. It's like consent is not a one-time thing. Like in any other relationship, you're not going to be saying, well, I got their consent 20 years ago. Like now they're complaining, right? This is an ongoing dynamic expectation in that. And is it going to be hard? Yes. But this is true actually with many other chapters in the standard, like water quality on mine site is going to also be dynamic, right? You might have a dramatic change in the runoff and its geochemistry 3 months after it looks like you don't have a problem there. So we are saying that this is an active relationship that you have with your community, especially for Indigenous communities who are frequently disproportionately impacted by the impacts of mining, but who could be getting benefits as that same company and as society is getting benefits from having access to the resources. So but I hope if you'll take a look at that, I'm happy to be a resource to you ahead, and please feel free to contact me directly as well. And I'd be happy to talk more with you about that.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you. Thank you all. I think that this has really been an excellent presentation, and Kristi, thank you so much for putting it together. It is time for our virtual lunch. And so, Brian, if you could put up our break slide, we will break for lunch. And also, we do have an opportunity at the end of the discussion today to dig into some more of these issues that are difficult to answer in the 3 minutes. So, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take good care.